Good afternoon. We will begin our classes here in this room each week at 10 minutes after the hour. We've passed around the syllabus that explains our plan. This year in the course, we have invited a number of distinguished economists to discuss with us our themes. Eight of the 11 weeks in the course. They won't be lecturing to us. They will be making brief, provocative statements, and we hope to spend most of the time of their visits interrogating them from the perspective of our agenda. And as a result of that, we want then in the first couple of classes to lay out our vision of the agenda from our complementary perspective. These classes will be videotaped, so you don't need to take copious notes of what goes on. And the videotape will be placed on the course website a few days after each class. The syllabus describes the reading and writing assignment. A number of the writing assignments will be on the Canvas website, which you should consult regularly. Undergraduate students will be enrolled in the weekly discussion section. The teaching assistant is here, Mohammed, would you stand up and introduce? Mohammed had an accent, so. And that's it. Is there something else we should discuss?
It would be helpful to have an idea about the distribution of where people are coming from. So, I know there are a number of you who intend to audit the course. Is the microphone working by the way?
It should work a little better.
I'm sorry?
It needs to be a little louder.
It needs to be louder. How many in the room currently are intending to audit the course? How many from the college? Kennedy School? And the law school? And I know there are a few from the School of Design. And others? Pleasure. Engineering. Okay. Economics. Good. So, we run this course as Roberto said, as essentially as a discussion and debate. The first two sessions will be a little bit different in that we're keen to get a few key ideas out before we have our visitors. So there will be a little bit more presentation, a little bit less discussion. But I just want to underscore that the discussion and debate is the core of this course, and if you don't keep up with the readings and thinking with the course, that you're not going to get too much out of the course. So that's it's essential to keep with the readings. The Kennedy School students who have weekly assignments will have to keep up with the readings. They have no other choice because they have to write memos based on the readings and prompts. But the rest of you who have sort of only periodic, or those of you who have just one paper at the end, I really encourage you to do the readings. Typically, Roberto and I do a fair amount of discussion, and we agree on some things, we disagree on many things. So we've been doing this for a number of years. This year, for the first time, we decided to invite a bunch of visitors to carry out our debate through them. And I'm not sure they know yet what we have in store for them. Okay, so unless there are questions on the logistics or the administration of the course, we're going to delve into the material. Good. Okay, what I'm going to be doing is starting us off with a a kind of an empirical background to the issues that we will be talking about, some relatively basic and straightforward facts about the recent economic record, the record on inequality and globalization. I'll say a few words about populism, although these are issues that we'll keep coming back to. Then I want to turn to the role of recent technological developments, because I think a key theme of our discussion is going to be the implications of these technological developments, both as an opportunity and as well as a key challenge for inclusion and equality. I will discuss, in this outline, there's also a heading under the political trilemma of the global economy and how to think conceptually about alternatives for globalization. I'm going to be postponing that for next week, so I'm not going to be talking about that. And I want to end with a bit of an introduction into how to think about different types of policies. And then we'll move on to Professor Unger, who will present a broader philosophical perspective on the alternatives. Okay, let me start with economic growth. What I'm showing you here is basically trends from the 1950s to today, the growth trends for two groups of countries, developed and developing. The blue line, which is kind of shows a smooth trend. So I basically smoothed the year-to-year fluctuations in growth rates by simply fitting a trend line. So you can see the bigger picture. You can see that the advanced countries, developing countries, generally have been experiencing a downward trend in their overall growth rate, relatively high in the 1950s and 60s, and sort of having come down. The developing countries is a very different kind of a pattern. In fact, it might be surprising that through about half of this period, through the mid-1980s, the developed countries were growing more rapidly than the developing countries. In other words, incomes on average were increasing more rapidly in the developed world than in the developing world. So, in fact, rather than economic convergence happening, there was divergence in a big way. Developing countries were being pulled apart. You see, sometime by the 1990s, this in fact changing very dramatically. A big part of the story, of course, is China, which takes a very large part of the aggregate for the developing countries. Since the 1990s, developing countries not only have been doing much better than the developed world, in fact, the gap has increased. You'll see an interesting twist at the very end, which is also, I think, important, that developing country growth rates have begun to come down. If you look very closely, you'll see a little bit of an uptick in the developed world. If you divide the developing world into three key regions, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, there too, there are sort of quite diverse outcomes. The region, of course, that has done the best in terms of overall economic growth is Asia. Latin America and Africa were close to Asia in the 50s and 60s. Then they started to do relatively much worse. And then there has been recently an uptick in Latin America and Africa, but then sort of a reduction in recent years at the same time, while Asia originally, thanks to Japan, is not included in Asia. Japan is included in the developed group, but early on, because of South Korea, Taiwan, East and Southeast Asia, later China, later India, the Asian performance has been much better. Okay? If we look at what has been happening within the developing world, within the developed world, here is sort of the performance with respect to economic growth and unemployment among 6 advanced countries: France, Italy, United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, and the United States. If we look what has happened since the financial crisis, taking as our base 2007, that is the year before the global financial crisis. The main thing is that most of these advanced countries, after a significant dip in performance due to the crisis, have recovered, but with some interesting exceptions. So if you look at the per capita GDP chart, what you see is one country there that is still actually below its 2000 level of GDP per capita. That's Italy. Okay? So it's actually incomes per head in Italy are still lower, more than a decade later, than where they were back in 2007. And similarly, with respect to unemployment, I think there's a very wide range of outcomes. And the countries that have done the worst are Italy and France, two countries with unemployment rates that are around 10% or even higher, whereas in the other countries, unemployment rates have come down. One of the themes that we will be talking about considerably here is that of technology and technological progress, the role of innovation, and how it can be harnessed for inclusive prosperity. A key paradox with respect to technology that I'll come back to in a few minutes is the apparent disconnect between the fact that innovation seems to be everywhere, but yet in terms of its overall effect in overall economy-wide productivity, aggregate productivity, its effects seem to have slowed down. Okay? So these two charts are two different measures of economy-wide productivity, that is, how efficiently are the economy's resources being utilized. The one on the right-hand side is labor productivity, simply how much does an average unit of labor produce in terms of goods and services. So it's a measure of labor productivity, the simplest measure of productivity. The one on the left-hand side is total factor productivity, which is a broader measure of productivity that also includes productivity or other factor inputs like capital, okay, in addition to labor. Whichever way you look at it, and I've highlighted with the red circle, you can see the flattening of this productivity, okay? So there's this, you might think that we live in one of the most innovative periods in history, and perhaps we do, but it's becoming harder and harder to actually see its effects on the overall productivity of the economy. That's one of the puzzles that we will come back to. Let me return to more familiar territory with respect to inequality. Inequality in general has been rising with some interesting exceptions, but how much it has risen also differs greatly across different parts of the world. Okay? Here is an interesting contrast between what has been happening in the United States and Western Europe. What this chart shows is the income share of the top 1%, the richest 1% of the population, and the income share of the bottom 50%, the poorer 50% of the population. First, look at the incredible picture for the United States, that by 2015, 2016, the income share of the richest 1% had risen from, essentially doubled, from somewhere around a little bit higher than 10% to something a little bit over 20%. Okay? That's the income share of the richest 1% of the population. And you do it for the richest 0.1%, richest 0.01%, the picture is even more striking. And correspondingly, the bottom 50% have seen a significant reduction of their income share from above 20% to something around 13%. Yeah? This is the striking increase in inequality in the United States that I'm sure everybody's familiar with. The picture in Western Europe, interestingly, is much more mixed. There have been some countries where there have been significant increase, such as in the UK, but in many of the continental Western European countries, in fact, we do not see such an increase. And that's what the right-hand side picture shows, where the increase in inequality is much more muted. That shows, I think, the important intermediating effects of social policies, social arrangements, well, the role of the government and the state and welfare state arrangements in mediating many of the same kind of technological and globalization shocks that both sets of countries have been subjected to. Inequality may have increased within most countries, with the extent to which it has increased differing. But if you look at inequality globally, which is to say, suppose there were no borders. Suppose we cared only about global inequality, and we treated a household in China or India, in Kenya, the same way we treated a household in the United States or in France. What can we say about global inequality as if there was just one big community without national borders? Okay? So we can try to approximate that global inequality by drawing a kind of a distribution, a map of the distribution of income across the entire world. And here I have a picture that shows what that distribution looks like for two different years, 1988 and 2011. Okay? Now, first look at the 1988 distribution of income. What you see is roughly a kind of a two hills. At the low end, you see a whole bunch of people in the world that are very poor. That's the high hill at the low end. And then there's a sort of a second, less distinctive hill up on the sort of the richer part of the distribution. That's where most of the households in the wealthy countries lived. So basically in 1988, the world was divided. It looked like the world was divided into a sort of a kind of a poor majority living mostly in the developing world, and a relatively wealthy minority mostly in the rich countries. The picture, the distribution in 2011 actually looks very different because essentially those two hills have disappeared. You have a much more continuous distribution, right? The middle of that distribution has filled out, right? If you look closely and you ask which distribution is more equal, the second distribution is actually much more compact. Seems much more equal. In fact, you can formalize that by sort of calculating what a global distribution, a measure of global distribution of inequality would be, like a Gini coefficient. And in fact, in the 2011, in the more recent period, the global inequality has reduced compared to the earlier period. Okay? So that's another kind of a source of tension when we think about inequality, is that global inequality has, if you look at within countries, has tended to increase, but if you look at inequality globally, it sort of has actually gone down. And the reason for that is largely because some very poor countries have grown very rapidly, and therefore a lot of very poor households in countries like China and later India have increased their income significantly. And that means that, in fact, global inequality, thanks to reduction in poverty and very high economic growth in those countries, global inequality has actually fallen on account of that. That is shown in sort of the poverty rates that we have across the world. Of course, the greatest reduction in poverty has been in Asia, again led by China, where poverty rates have generally tended to come down elsewhere as well, but not as rapidly. Here's a picture that essentially sums up all that discussion about inequality. It's a version of something you might have heard about, the elephant curve, due to Branko Milanovic, and this is the elephant curve with the most recent data. So once again, sort of this looks at the world as a whole. Okay? Suppose there are no countries. We just have a world. And we can align the world's households from the poorest to the richest and look at what has happened to incomes across that entire income spectrum. Okay? The reason this is called the elephant curve was the earliest rendition sort of looked more like the elephant with a body of the elephant and then the trunk at the tail end. But the interesting picture here is this kind of these very heterogeneous effects on incomes and prosperity in different parts of the world. Clearly, the group that has done the best by far are the very wealthy, or the richest, the top 1%. In fact, it says top 1% has actually captured 27% of total growth. At the sort of the next group that has done the best are probably the middle and upper middle classes in the developing world in general, particularly East Asia and Asia. That's sort of what's called the rise of emerging countries. Again, countries like China that have grown at 9-10% a year, more recently India. Those households generally poor by the standards of the world, but they have increased their incomes very significantly. And then there are two groups of countries, or two groups of households that are actually haven't done that well. One is this sort of the 90%, the bottom 90% of the population in the advanced countries. So that's the crisis of the middle class and the lower middle classes in Western Europe and much more so dramatically in the United States. And also at the very low end, the poorest households in some ways, sort of some of the most isolated communities, households in places like Africa, and also to some extent in South Asia, actually haven't done all that well. Yeah? So very different kind of picture. Yeah? I'll take questions sort of at the end, so just hold on to them for a second. Let me turn to a few facts on economic globalization. We tend to think about globalization as one of the defining features of our time, but globalization has a history too, and in particular, we've seen highs and lows of globalization. That we, going back to the late 19th century, during the period of the gold standard era, capital flows, financial globalization was as advanced as it is now. So you can see that from the red curve, which is sort of a rough estimate of how much financial globalization there was. So we had another period historically of very advanced levels of globalization, both in terms of the mobility of capital, as well as, of course, the mobility of labor. That's the yellow curve, which is gives you the migrant stock as a share of population. That also reached very high levels before World War I, before coming down. And really the only area of globalization where today we have in fact are experiencing clearly much more globalization than before is with respect to goods and services, the trade in goods and services. Right? But in some important other respects, in particular with respect to capital and labor mobility, this is the second era of advanced globalization. And as we'll see, there are important lessons from the earlier era as well. Recently, there have been concerns about whether we have hit kind of a turning point in globalization. There are some signs that in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, there was a kind of a reduction in particularly the level of cross-border financial flows. And then the recovery since then hasn't been complete, as you can see in this picture. So we seem to have reached a kind of a plateau that's somewhere lower than the heights of globalization we had in the period before the global financial crisis. So cross-border financial flows are somewhat lower, particularly in Europe. It's also the case that with respect to offshoring and global outsourcing and global value chains, that those also seem to have reached a certain kind of a plateau. You hear a lot these days about reshoring, bringing supply chains back home. rather than simply outsourcing and foreign investment. These, as we'll speak about later, these are driven primarily by technological phenomena rather than the kind of globalization backlash in the political sphere that in some ways is more recent. Okay? You all know, of course, that behind the globalization backlash is this sort of declining legitimacy in the eyes of many, in the advanced countries in particular, of existing arrangements for the international trading system. So if you look at the panel on the right-hand side, if you ask the question, does trade destroy jobs? 59% of the respondents in Italy say yes. 50% of the US in the US says. Similarly, very high proportions of respondents tend to think that trade lowers wages rather than increase prosperity. Very high proportion of respondents tend to think that foreign companies buying domestic companies is actually a good thing. So these are striking. Many of these same questions, if you ask them to respondents in developing countries, you'll get a much more favorable view of globalization. And presumably that's not entirely independent from the fact that, as I discussed earlier, in the last 2 or 3 decades, in general, residents of developing countries have done much better in terms of economic prosperity compared to the vast majority of people in the advanced countries. One possible consequence of some of these forces, inequality in particular, but also the fact that the benefits of technology in recent periods have not been disseminated throughout society, and the lingering consequences of what has come to be called sort of austerity policies in response to the global financial crisis that we'll come back to extensively in this course, is this apparently inexorable rise in the political appeal of populist parties. I'll give you my definition of populism in a second, but this chart basically shows the electoral strength in 31 European countries of different types of populists. First, the aggregate you can see is clearly rising from well below 10% 20 years ago to more than 25% today. You can also see that most of this rise is concentrated in right-wing populists rather than left-wing populists. Okay? Another distinction which I think is important, and I'll come back to in a second. So what's distinctive about populism? There are a lot of discussions and debates about the meaning of populism. I don't want to attach a normative, populism is good or populism bad, kind of a label to it at all in this discussion. But I want to simply identify what I think is some of the key features of populist movements or populist leaders or populist governments. A key feature is a claim to represent that there's a people that stand as a whole, that there's a whole, it's called the people, and leaders, populist leaders claim to represent and speak for that people. And the people are unified by a common interest, and that common interest sets them against various enemies of the people. Okay? In practical terms, populists exercise power or express their desire for power in ways that are marked by an explicit rejection on the restraints on the use of executive authority. After all, since they talk for the people and the people have a common interest, anything that stands in the way of the exercise of the popular will is necessarily undemocratic. Okay? And therefore, people's will, as exercised through populist leaders, should not be restrained by agencies of restraint. What are those possible agencies of restraint? We can think of them as very crudely as coming in two kinds, but depending on which kind of agency of restraint becomes the target, I think you get very different type of populist movements. One, perhaps the most important, are political agencies of restraint, various institutions that we associate with division of powers or the separation of powers under liberal political systems, such as an independent judiciary, independent regulatory agencies, or a free media. And political populism exhibits itself through opposition to those independent agencies. But there's a kind of an economic version that does that for the economic analog of those independent agencies. So those would be agencies that limit the autonomy of the executive in conducting economic policy. And those could be an independent central bank, it could be independent trade commissions, or it could be international trade agreements, or in the context of the European Union, it could be Brussels. But those independent agencies would constitute those restraints in the economic sphere, which then become the target of economic populists. In today's discussion on the rise of populism, I think it's fair to say that there are sort of two camps that identify different roots of populism. The one that we are, to a much greater extent, will be focusing on here are really much more the socio-economic roots of populism that have to do with the economic anxieties, dislocations, inequalities that have been exacerbated by the global financial crisis and an extreme form of a hyper globalist set of international economic arrangements, which I'll talk about more next time. So in this version of the rise of populism story, it's really fundamentally rooted in problems of inequality, unemployment, economic anxiety, an increase in the economic and social gap between the elites and the non-elites. But of course, a second set of explanations, and that are much more cultural. That in that kind of the kind of version that populism is actually rooted much more in a kind of long-standing, beneath the surface sense of identity and problems of exclusion based on identity, a resurgence of nativism, and the identification of an other in terms of immigrants or foreigners, or racial and religious and ethnic minorities within a country's own borders. So in this rendition, populism is a kind of a backlash, not against economic and social gaps, but as much as it is as a conservative backlash against social liberalism. I think there's a kind of reconciliation of those two, which is the way that I think about it. And it starts by distinguishing between sort of where is the latent demand for populism, and on the other hand, in what form is populism then delivered by populist leaders, or what kind of narratives are supplied to satisfy that demand. So in that kind of a frame, then the demand for populism essentially has its roots fundamentally in these economic dislocations, because after all, it is these economic dislocations that are relatively recent and new. So if you ask what has changed in the last 30 years to enable this backlash. What has changed is fundamentally some of these economic facts. On the supply side, how the political system or political leaders or political movements or political parties respond to this latent demand, what kind of a narrative they supply, provides then this a kind of distinction which has now become commonplace between a right-wing and a left-wing populism. So the right-wing narrative is nativist, ethno-nationalist, and for that the enemy of the people are the foreigners or the racial, ethnic, or religious minorities within the nation, because those are the other. And for the left-wing narrative, which is based on a much more sort of economic story, the other, or the enemies of the people, are essentially the big corporations, big finance, and the misapplications of economic policy, or the bad economic policies, such as austerity, or kind of trade agreements or trade deals that advantage the minority at the expense of the majority. Let me say a few things about a little bit more about the role of technology. And I want to emphasize two aspects of technology that I think is going to frame many of our discussions here, both as an opportunity and potentially as a significant challenge. The first aspect that I want to stress of technology is the sense in which technological trends in recent decades is exacerbating important labor market duality that is creating winners and losers and a kind of excluding many from the potential benefits of prosperity. And the second aspect of technology, which I want to emphasize, is particularly relevant for low-income or emerging market economies, and that this aspect of technology is with respect to how it might be disadvantaging those countries through the channel of what we might call premature deindustrialization. Yeah. Under this broad heading of challenges, I want to talk not today, but next week, on sort of globalization and global economic arrangements at the same time as well. And there's a common theme that ties technological changes and economic globalization, which is key to our course, which is that often we take both technological change and its impacts and economic globalization and its impacts as essentially largely out of our control, as if it falls onto our laps. Technology happens. International economic integration happens, and it creates effects. Our approach in this course is very much that we can actually shape both how technology happens and what its effects are going to be, how they're going to be disseminated, and also that we can shape economic globalization, that these aren't sort of exogenous constraints that just fall from the sky on our laps, but these are actually things that are shaped by our own decisions and we have significant agency in both areas. So postponing the discussion on globalization, let me just say a few words about technology. The discussions today on technology are divided between what we might call techno-optimists and techno-pessimists. Techno-optimists look at everything that's happening in robotics, biotech, AI, the digital technologies, and they see a future that's brighter than any that has been imagined in the past. They recognize that the implications and the dissemination of these technologies have been limited so far. After all, I've already shown you that the actual numbers on productivity don't show anything like this bright picture. But the argument becomes, in the techno-optimist version of the story, is if we invest enough in skills, if we have the right infrastructure, we don't screw up with macroeconomic policy, then these benefits will eventually be shared widely. There's a second group, the techno-pessimists, and the techno-pessimists are divided amongst themselves. They're pessimists on account of two different reasons. One group of pessimists basically disagree with the premise that the scale of innovation and its ultimate impact is going to be nearly as significant as what the techno-optimists claim. Robert Gordon, for example, the economic historian at Northwestern, is a key proponent of this view, which is that nothing compares today to, for example, electrification, or the introduction of mass production techniques, or various public hygiene technologies. That nothing today could the iPhone is wonderful and yields tremendous consumer surplus, but doesn't change fundamentally the way that the economy works. So in that view, these applications of the new technology will necessarily remain limited to a few sectors, and therefore the picture that I've showed you, which is stagnant productivity change, relatively stagnant productivity change, will continue. The second group of pessimists disagree or agree with the premise that technological change, these automation, robotics, digital technology, AI, is a big deal, and it'll fundamentally affect the way that our societies and economies work, but they fret about what the effects on labor markets are going to be. That it's going to aggravate the dualism that I've talked about, that there'll be a group of winners that become bigger and bigger winners, and those who can't catch up or necessarily are disassociated from these trends will be excluded, and the effects will show up not necessarily in unemployment, but will show up in much lower wages. Okay? So driverless cars and trucks will be very bad news it will revolutionize transport, but it will be very bad news for taxi drivers and truck drivers. The developing country version of this is, once again, it's a story of rapid dissemination, rapid global diffusion of technology, versus a story of the more rapid technology changes, the more it disadvantages countries whose main advantage is actually producing things that don't require a lot of technology. So part of the story of reshoring of supply chains becomes that developing countries or emerging markets are now less plugged into global supply chains. Their export opportunities are being reduced because the advantage they had, which was lots of cheap labor, is now being supplanted by new technologies. So the moment that you can actually produce, let's say, shoes with 3D printing, right, you no longer need to produce them in Africa or in Ethiopia with cheap labor. That's a big loss for the export opportunities or production opportunities for developing countries. When we look at the evidence here again, I think what we see on the technological front is largely a story of disappointment, both in the developed world and the developing world. The story in the developed world is this story of dualism that is being aggravated, in particular between firms and sectors that are doing very well, the leading firms in every sector, versus those that are behind. So you look at the firms that are the winners and those who are trying to catch up. There's divergence rather than convergence that is happening. So of course, in platform network industries, you see this by one big winner that captures the entire industry. In many other industries where you don't have those network externalities, you see it by the most productive firms, what's called here the frontier firms, advancing in productivity growth much more rapidly than other competing firms. Big gap opening up between the winners and the relative those who are being left behind. Okay? In the developing world, this is even more so the case. In the developing world has always been dualistic in the sense that countries where some workers were in the more productive, more formal parts of the economy, and others that were in the informal or in traditional industries or in the countryside producing subsistence agriculture. Perhaps paradoxically, one consequence of the trends in globalization of the last 30, 40 years of many countries participating to a much greater extent in international trade and investment has been that in many of those countries, the sectors and the firms that have integrated themselves into global economy have remained rather limited. And the dissemination of employment, know-how, technology, management skills to the rest of the economy has remained very limited. One country where you see this, and this is why a picture from Mexico, one country where you see this very strongly is Mexico, where people talk about two Mexicos. So the part that has integrated with North America, with North American supply chains, and the rest of Mexico. And not only that, is the lagging part of Mexico that is the part that is expanding. Because as more people, more young people join into the labor force, they end up finding jobs not in the modern, more export-oriented, more productive parts of Mexico in the north, because those, after all, very technology-intensive, they're very skill-intensive, they're very capital-intensive. They don't hire many workers. But where the jobs come are in the traditional informal parts. So not only do you have two Mexicos, but they're being actually driven apart. Okay? So it's an extreme case. Mexico is a bit of an extreme case, but it's certainly not a unique case in a way that international economic integration has actually been accompanied by domestic disintegration. Okay? And that disintegration, of course, is linked up with some of the trends about inequality that I've shown you before. The second point here is that I think fundamentally, and this is another one of our key themes, so fundamentally, the problems that developed countries face today are increasingly looking like the problems of developing countries, that of productive dualism, that of sort of relatively narrow segment of advanced sectors in manufacturing and services and high-tech agriculture that is able to absorb a relatively limited amount of high-skilled labor and professionals, but large part of the economy essentially relatively unproductive, and that's sort of absorbing by default the workers that remain. And the only difference there between the developed and the developing world is what's the size of that most productive segment of the economy. So in a country like Ethiopia, it might be only 5%. In the United States, it might be maybe 25%. But other than that, structurally, more and more, these countries are beginning to look the same. And I will also argue with many of the similar implications for the politics that these kinds of productive dualistic structures develop. Now, the concrete form that this is taking, the process takes in the developing world is what I've called a process of premature deindustrialization. That is that countries that normally would have gone through a phase of industrialization the way that Britain did through the Industrial Revolution, Northwest Europe did, then the United States did, then Japan did, then South Korea and Taiwan did, and then most recently China did. that path seems to become more and more unachievable for today's developing countries. So the typical pattern of structural change during the course of development is something that looks like this. You start out with all your people in agriculture producing traditional subsistence kind of agriculture. Over time, they move into, you have a process of industrialization, they move into manufacturing, and not only that, they move into sort of formal manufacturing establishments. And the importance of that is that with that comes representation and a whole series of political ramifications of that. Workers get organized. Trade unions, labor unions form. They demand different kinds of policies. Labor-based politics, political movements develop as a result of this process of industrialization. Of course, political democracy, in turn, has been a consequence of this transformation. Ultimately, of course, manufacturing begins to, you move into a kind of the tertiary sector, you move into the post-industrial phase. But that comes relatively late in the process of development, or at least it used to. Today, if you look at where people are going in the developing world, the process looks much like that. They're moving directly from traditional agriculture into urban services, but those services are nothing like what you associate with the post-industrial societies. They're very low productivity, petty services, informal economic activities, really for lack of opportunities in formal parts of the economy. And the sense, in some way, in which the developed world, the advanced industrial countries, are beginning to mimic this process is in reverse, that having developed these industrial sectors, increasingly as deindustrialization happens, and increasingly as the most advanced services are unable to absorb a lot of labor, that workers are being shunted to sort of more disorganized, low productivity, or more informal, if you will, the gig economy. Now, this is of significant economic implication for the developing world, because manufacturing, the reason that industrialization was an escalator for growth, the reason that every country that became rich essentially went through industrialization, is because the ability of manufacturing to absorb new technologies, frontier technologies, to absorb a lot of labor early on. Just you can get people from the countryside and turn them into production workers rather quickly. And because once you develop certain capabilities, you can export. So South Korea and Taiwan started by producing very simple manufactures, very labor-intensive, simple manufactures, toys, wigs, simple garments. And from then, they sort of moved on to other things. Most services are not like that. In the developing world, you look at services, it's essentially two kinds of services. The high productivity services tend to be very skill intensive, so therefore they're unable to absorb the surplus or the mass of unskilled labor that these countries still have. And then the bulk of services that do absorb labor, they tend to be sort of these petty services or informal, low productivity services that on their own are not going to be the source of economic growth. Okay, so we are interested in this course in trying to handle some of these challenges and answer particular types of questions about sort of how we can turn this corner in terms of imagining societies that are both prosperous and are inclusive. So that will mean thinking about how these trends about inequality and economic growth and opportunity can be reversed. And that'll take us I think, fairly deep into thinking through the institutions of capitalism, the institutions that sustain a market economy, that generate a market economy, and the variety of those institutions, and deploying our imagination to think about what some of those alternative institutions might look like. Now, you can think about some different ways of thinking about that. You might think we're doing fine, business as usual. You can think about what I've called here a strategy of neoliberalism plus, which is to say basically the only problem is that we haven't done enough sharing the wealth. So that if you simply combine the system that we have, but redistribute a little bit more, compensate more, so that's the way to go. A third possible strand of thinking about these issues is to say, look, a lot of these problems are global and common, and so what we need to do is really strengthen our institutions of global governance. So we need to form better global institutions, better global alliances, better global networks for better rules on taxes, and finance, and labor, and environmental standards, and so forth. Or we can think about sort of more radical departures from current paths, from existing paths. Okay? That could be sort of moving towards a much more protectionist and isolationist direction, which is what a lot of the right-wing populists seem to want. You can try to recreate this developmentalism that we'll talk about later in this course. We can try to see how this innovation that is very strong and obviously happening, how can that be democratized and how can the benefits be disseminated more broadly through society. We can think about the kind of institutional setting that will enable that in ways that Professor Unger calls a kind of democratic experimentalism as the institutional complement of that. Now, before I pass on to Roberto, I just want to make a kind of an introductory stab about sort of the typology of policies that you can think about in this kind of context, and what I think is fundamentally different in this course in terms of what we'll be focusing on. Okay? So think about this as a kind of how the economy generates a kind of rewards for different people. Start from the top. Right? Every individual comes to the economy, joins the market with a set of endowments, skills, capital. Their networks, their social networks are part of their endowments. Then they join production. They have ability, they have opportunities, a lot, perhaps, or a little, to involve themselves in production, in exchange, in coming up with new products. That's the production innovation stage. From that comes what we might call the pre-redistribution state of rewards. So that production state generates profits, wages, rents. Okay? And from that we get the income and wealth distribution of society, okay? So you can imagine intervening, you can imagine a set of policies, a set of institutional arrangements that intervene in this process or interfere this process, or interfere seems to be normatively loaded, shape and reshape elements of this process through different kinds of policies. For example, the most direct form is to simply interfere at the stage where the market has produced its rewards, but then the government comes in, takes something from some people and gives it to other people. It reshapes to redistribution. So there's a pre-tax and post-tax, pre-transfer, post-tax transfer distribution. Right? So those would be our policies on progressive income taxation, the wealth tax that Senator Warren has proposed, right? That's where we're interfering, is we're not interfering with how the market economy works. We're simply redistributing the rewards after the fact. You can reshape the very early initial stage of opportunities, the endowments that people come into these production arrangements with to begin with. Right? You can enlarge or affect the endowments that people have through investments in education, through universal basic income, which is to give everybody a stake from the get-go. Right? Or you can have a social fund that gives everybody a certain capital endowment. Okay? And third, you can actually try to reshape the domain of production and innovation. That's sort of shaping the relationship between capital and labor. That would be affecting their bargaining through policies on labor unions or policies on regulation, policies on corporate governance. Or you can reshape the relationship between leading firms in sectors and other competitors through antitrust policy or through competition policies. You can reshape the relationship between the winners and their suppliers and others, their local communities, through various industrial policies and other things that affect the relationship between these productive firms and their suppliers or their local communities and other stakeholders. So those are sort of policies and institutions that actually try to reshape the field within which production and innovation takes place. Those are three different types of policies or institutional arrangements. Okay? We will be focusing a lot on these kinds, okay? Because I think this is the area where, in our discussion about how to create more inclusive societies, that's the part which I think gets the least amount of attention and potentially is the most rewarding, rather than giving people simply transfers, simply redistributing resources, is actually making people more productive. Getting more inclusion by including individuals and people in these more productive networks of production and innovation. Okay? That, I think, is the critical challenge. So I'm going to stop, and I'm going to ask, we'll discuss all of these things. So I will ask if there are questions only on sort of questions of interpretation, not questions for debating or discussion, because we want to move on to Roberto. But if there's anything I've said that was unclear, and you want to ask any question about that, do that now. Okay, very good. Roberto.
What I propose to do now is to state a view that in some respects complements what Danny Bergman has said, and in other respects anticipates disagreement about the central themes of this course. And to that end, I want to distinguish three background themes and then a foreground theme. A theme that, from my standpoint, will lie at the center of our discussions here throughout the semester. The three background themes I propose to put under the labels of agency, structure, and experimentalism. Agency. Step back from the technical discussions of economics and economic policy, and from the conventional ideological disputes between the right and the left. And ask yourself, what is striking and disturbing about the ordinary economic experience of humanity in contemporary societies? There seems to be a huge disproportion between human effort, the effort that people expend in their daily activity, and what comes of it. It's as if most people throughout the world, in even the richest societies, were condemned to some kind of make work. They spend their life force on pursuits that have meager results, and devote their intensity to unworthy objects. And their ordinary experience is an experience of belittlement and humiliation. In the narrowest economic sense, we can say that their work is relatively unproductive, and that they lack the instruments and opportunities to become more productive. They are distant in their societies from the most advanced practice of production in their time. The most advanced practice of production is always the practice that is closest to the imagination. The antidote to this belittlement would be empowerment, the enhancement of agency, of the agency of ordinary men and women in their material lives. Agency is the capacity to act. To act within the context, beyond the context, and against the context. And agency is an ideal or an interest of ours that stands at the intersection between our material and our moral aspirations. It has to do, on one side, with the productivity of labor and its results, but on another side, with the secret longing in the heart of every man and woman to become bigger, and if possible, to become bigger together, so that he or she can live in such a way that he or she dies only once. Now, the liberals and socialists of the 19th century believed, each group of them, that there was a formula, a set of institutional arrangements that would ensure the convergence of our material interests in economic growth and of our moral interests in the emancipation of humanity from entrenched social division and hierarchy, from oppression. And we can no longer believe that. We can no longer believe that there is a dogmatic blueprint that would ensure the convergence of our material and moral interests. And we are sometimes tempted to adopt the equally dogmatic inverse of that hope, the belief that there is a tragic contradiction between our material and moral interests. What we might more reasonably think is that there is some zone of possible overlap, of intersection between the institutional requirements of our material and moral interests. That there is some set of arrangements that would allow us to develop the practical powers of society and to sustain economic growth, but that would do so in a way that would liberate people from these circumstances of oppression and belief. And that zone of intersection is what we could describe as the zone of the enhancement of agency. The empowerment of the individual relates both to our economic growth and to our emancipation, to our path toward a greater life, our ascent. But to find that zone of intersection requires institutional imagination. And that brings us then to the second background theme in the course. The second background theme is the theme of structure. The supreme object of theoretical and practical ambition in society is the understanding and transformation of the structure. Of the institutions, the economic and political institutions that shape the routines of everyday life and determine for the ordinary man and woman the limits of the possible. Now, one aspect of the structure is the organization of the economy, and in particular the institutions that define the market economy. We tend to think in our contemporary circumstance that there are basically only two things that you can do with the market economy. You can regulate it, or you can attenuate after the fact the inequalities that it generates through retrospective and compensatory redistribution, by progressive taxation and by redistributive social entitlements. So on this view, the market is a tremendous instrument for the creation of wealth. In creating wealth, it aggravates inequalities, and these inequalities can be corrected after the fact by progressive taxation and social entitlements. What this view denies is the existence of a third thing that you can do with the market economy, which may actually be much more important. You can redefine its content. The institutions and the rules that organize the decentralization of economic initiative. Now here we are in the law school. The most important analytic achievement of legal thought from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century was to discover and demonstrate that a market economy has no single natural and necessary form. But this discovery, produced often involuntarily against the motivations of the jurists, has never fully penetrated the inner sanctum of practical economic thinking. To this day, the practical economist and many an economic theorist continues to think that a market is a market, property is property, and contract is contract. And the lawyers know that that is false. Now, in the whole period, from the middle of the 20th century to today, in practical politics, in the rich North Atlantic countries, the dominant project has been to reconcile the social protection of the Europeans with the economic flexibility of the Americans. Within a barely adjusted version of the inherited institutional framework of the market economy. The denial of any possibility of fundamental transformation in the institutional content of the market. And the same situation is reproduced in the experience of thought, of social theory and social science. Each of the contemporary social sciences evades in a different way the imperative of structural insight, of the imagination of structural alternatives. And not to imagine alternatives is not to understand the phenomenon. To understand something is always to understand what it can become. Not what it can become remotely in some horizon of ultimate possibles, but what it can become next in the realm of the adjacent possible. So the result of this severing of the link between insight into the actual and imagination of the adjacent possible is to transform social science, all the social sciences, each in its own way, into a kind of mystification, a retrospective rationalization of the existing. On the other hand, we have classical social theories, like Marxism, that did have a view of structural alternatives. But they embedded that idea of structural alternatives in a kind of deterministic mythology. They taught that there's a closed menu of possible systems in history, and that they follow each other according to inescapable laws in a foreordained historical succession. And none of those assumptions are believable today. Now, the result is that we do not have available to us a credible, usable way of thinking about structural change, structural discontinuity, and structural alternatives. Let me give you an example that Danny mentioned in passing in the first half of the class that shows the importance of this theme in our debates about inequality. In this contemporary institutionally conservative social democracy or neoliberalism that shapes the programmatic horizon of contemporary events in practical political economy, the whole focus is on compensatory and retrospective redistribution by tax and transfer. But there's very little that can be achieved fundamentally to alter the distribution of economic advantage and opportunity through these retrospective means. For example, progressive taxation. You can increase progressive taxation, but you would have to increase it massively for it to make a real dent on the inequalities that exist in contemporary society. And long before it reached that requisite dimension, it would begin to destabilize the economic arrangements and incentives to work, to save, and to invest. So this contradiction is captured in the traditional rhetoric of a tension between equity and efficiency. Entitlements matter, but they don't matter because they diminish inequality, which they moderate only at the margin. They matter because they can contribute to the enhancement of agency by giving people endowments and instruments that enable them to act. To change the basic facts about inequality, we have to reorganize the structure. Not by some fantastical systemic substitution, a substitution of one system for another, but by structural change that is fragmentary but nevertheless cumulative, so that although gradual in its method, it may be radical in its outcome. Now that's what we don't have. The development of ideas about structure is intimately related to the theme of agency. If we can't master the structure, if we can't reimagine it, and then go on to reshape it, we are not free. But how then are we to develop this imagination of structure? That brings me to the third background theme in the course, the theme of experimentalism. It seems that we need to discover the structure along the way. We have come, or we must come, to recognize the primacy of structural change. As the liberals and socialists of the 19th century did. But unlike them, we can no longer trust our futures to dogmatic structural blueprints. There is no definitive institutional formula of the kind that the liberals and socialists in the 19th century proposed. We must organize in our economic and political lives a process that allows us to develop and discover structural alternatives, to try them out, and to select them. The idea of experimentalism is not an empty idea. Given our points of departure, the institutional materials and conceptions with which we must work, this institutional experiment is likely to have a very definite content. So, for example, in political life, in the organization of democracy, it may mean that we must develop a form of democratic life that no longer requires crisis in the form of military conflict or economic ruin to make change possible. A form of political life that elevates the temperature of politics, the level of popular engagement, in political life, that hastens the pace of politics, the rapid resolution of impasse, and that makes it possible for parts of a country to secede from the general solutions, taking advantage, for example, of the experimentalist potential of federalism, and to develop counter models of the national future. And what would this experimentalism mean in the organization of our economic life? It would mean that the market economy would not be fastened to a single version of itself. There is no natural and necessary form of a market economy. And therefore, different mechanisms of economic decentralization, including different regimes of property and contracts, should coexist experimentally within the same market order. If the most advanced practice of production is the one that is closest to the imagination and most radically experimental, then an experimentalist economic order is one that disseminates this most advanced practice, that opens the gateways of access to it in favor of the largest number of economic agents. And the idea of economic experimentalism might have implications, for example, for the relation between a worker and a machine. In Adam Smith's pin factory or Henry Ford's assembly line, the worker worked as if he were one of his machines, through repetitious movements that mirrored the movements of the machine. But that's not what machines should be for. Everything that we have learned how to repeat, we express in a formula or an algorithm. And what we can express formulaically and algorithmically, we embody in a physical contraption, the machine. The machine should do for us everything that we have learned how to repeat, so that we can reserve our supreme resource, our time, for what is not yet repeatable. And then this combination of the machine and the anti-machine, the human being with imagination, will be much more powerful than either of them alone. If we were not able to experiment, if experimentalism were not the very soul of our institutional arrangement, we would not be free, we would not have agency. And the dead would continue to rule over the living. Now, these are the background themes of the course. But the forefront theme, the theme which may come to stand at the center of our debates here, and our interrogation of our visitors, is a particular dilemma about economic development or growth that will increasingly be central to the economic life and debates of the contemporary societies. The dilemma was already adumbrated in Danny's remarks earlier. The message of classical development economics, the development economics that reached its apogee in the second half of the 20th century, was there is a shortcut to growth. The shortcut can be summarized in a single word: industrialization. Move workers and resources from the relatively less productive to the relatively more productive parts of the economy, meaning in practice, move them from agriculture to industry. Industry being traditional mass production. The large-scale production of standardized goods and services by rigid machines and production processes on the basis of semi-skilled labor and in very hierarchical and specialized relations of production. There were, of course, the so-called fundamentals, education and institutions. But according to this doctrine, there could be a quick march to convergence to the most developed economies by the use of the shortcut. Now, this shortcut has stopped working all over the world. And we're going to discuss during the semester why it has stopped working. But a very simple initial explanation of why it has stopped working is this: that conventional industry, mass production manufacture, is no longer the vanguard of production. It is a leftover, a residue of an earlier vanguard of production, or it is a sidekick of a new vanguard of production. There is a new vanguard, which we call the innovation economy, the knowledge economy, the new economy, dense in knowledge, radically experimental, and dependent on very advanced technology. And this old vanguard finds that it is increasingly outcompeted, even on its own terrain, by the new vanguard, which can produce more and better the things which it produced. Or if it is not a residue, a leftover, it is a sidekick. It is a junior partner commanded by the new vanguard. The new vanguard finds a way to commodify, to transform into commodities, into routines, part of what it does, and then allocates it to this sidekick in distant parts of the world. And then there's a race to the bottom, to the countries that pay the lowest wages with the lowest tax take. So the old formula for economic growth has stopped working. But what's the alternative? The alternative would be an inclusive form of the new vanguard, the knowledge economy. But the new vanguard doesn't exist in inclusive form, even in the richest countries in the world, with the most educated population. It exists only in insular form. It is no longer restricted to industry. It can't be identified just with high-tech manufacture. It exists also in the form of knowledge-intensive services and precision or scientific agriculture. But wherever it exists as a fringe that excludes the vast majority of workers and firms. That's the only way in which it exists. And if it is a fringe in even the richest economies with the most educated populations, how could it not be a fringe in the rest of the world? So there we have the problem. The problem is that the old formula of growth has stopped working, and the alternative to it seems to be inaccessible. The alternative would be an inclusive form of the knowledge economy. I want to argue in the course of the semester that this dilemma can be broken only on the second side. There is no way to bring conventional mass production industry back to life. The only way in which the dilemma can be broken is by transforming the seemingly inaccessible alternative into an accessible one. By breaking the task into steps or into pieces so that the knowledge economy can be made inclusive. And that task then relates directly to what I earlier described as the three background themes of the course. Agency. It is the condition to ensure agency to the mass of ordinary men and women today. Structure, because it can only be achieved through structural change. And to change the structure, we need first to reimagine it. And experimentalism. Because there is no blueprint for this alternative, and because the alternative itself consists in the organization and radicalization of experimentalism. Now, this is a vast intellectual agenda for which our tools and resources are completely inadequate. In dealing with this disproportion between the tasks that we have set for ourselves and the instruments that are available to us, the quality that we most need is relentlessness. If we can't be masterly, let's at least be relentless.
Great. We do have some time for questions and discussion, so I have questions for you. I'll restrain myself on this.
Maybe we could lead us into the discussion.
I don't want this to be sort of, I want people to get used to putting their ideas and views forward, otherwise this will be just a dialogue between us and our guests. So I do want people to participate. Yes.
It seems that both of you mentioned.
Now, speak very loudly so the people in the back are hearing.
Okay. It seems you both mentioned the taxation, especially the warrants to extend taxation on top of the wealth, which looks pretty much like the proposals take a quantitative proposal. So it seems you are very opposite. You have very opposite opinion. Could you have some discussion
I don't know if we have opposite views on that, do we?
I mean, no, I think the question is whether we disagree from particularly on
Oh, from them. Yeah.
I
Indeed.
My view would be that that is useful, but not enough for a lot of reasons that Professor Lieber has stated. I think that I do think there is a role for significant increasing the progressivity of taxation, certainly a role for the wealth tax. Because it is needed to generate resources for funding social entitlements and for funding infrastructure, for funding many of the other things that we might not talk about. But that I do think, and this is I think where we agree, is that that if you want to democratize the market economy, you need to democratize the process of production, innovation, and dissemination. That is that we need to provide individuals with the opportunity to grow themselves or to act, to grow into their full agency or to expand their agency.
Let me take a more radical view, more intransigent than what Jenny Andre just said. So first, I reiterate the thesis that progressive taxation, whether of income, wealth, or consumption, has only a marginal effect on inequality. It has never had more than a marginal effect on inequality. Never. In no country and in no historical period. It would have to be massive to produce such an effect. And outside the special conditions of wartime, that's impossible. It doesn't mean that it's not justified, but it has a subsidiary role. And its greatest use is to sustain a high level of investment in people and their capabilities. The progressives who propose at election time progressive taxation, for the most part, understand that progressive taxation has only a marginal effect. It seems that they propose it as a proxy for the structural program that they don't have. And a large part of this role is to signify on whose side they are. Now, that's no good. So, what's needed is the missing structural program. Now, in furtherance of this thesis, let me make a second remark. The fundamental reason why the tax and budgetary systems of the European social democracies are relatively more egalitarian than the American system is not that the European systems resort more heavily to progressive taxation. They don't. On paper, the American tax system is in many respects more progressive than the tax systems of the European social democracies, because it gives a more central role to the progressive taxation of individual income. The fundamental reason why the European systems are relatively more progressive in this subsidiary role of taxation and social spending is very simple. That the European social democracies take at least 10% more of GDP in public revenue than the Americans do. And then they spend it progressively. They rely heavily on the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption, especially through the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax. But everything that they sacrifice in progressivity on the revenue-raising side, they then gain in double on the spending side. The Americans don't understand that or don't want to understand that. And so there's this charade about progressive taxation. So it's not the way to think. The way to think is that structural change has priority over taxation and social spending. And in the subsidiary system of taxation and social spending, the aggregate level of the tax take and how it is spent has priority over the relatively progressive profile of the tax system. If you have a regressive tax which is neutral with respect to the system of relative prices, like the value-added tax, you can maximize the public revenue while minimizing the disturbance to economic arrangements and incentives. You can finance the state, and the state can then take progressive initiatives. But don't delude yourself into thinking that that's a substitute for structural change. It's the right way to design the subsidiary element in this transformation of inequality.
One area where I've learned, Roberto, you're progressive in every domain except for taxation, where you prefer regressive. Let me ask you in the last 5 minutes, just to, I agree with you that mass production is not coming back and it's not the solution. And a large part of the solution, and what we're focusing on here, is how we can expand the dissemination and the scope of the most advanced firms and sectors of the economy, which is called the vanguard. Now, so just to highlight the contrast between your perspective on how to do this and the conventional or the orthodox perspective. The orthodox perspective would say, yes, of course, that's what we need to do. The solution to that is by investing in skills and education, by eliminating red tape and bureaucracy and ensuring that small and medium-sized enterprises can, level playing field, by investing in infrastructure, all those sort of nice fundamentals on which most economists will agree. So you'll just say a little bit more about why you think that that's not the right approach and what the structural and the experimentalist approach insists on.
So, undoubtedly, an inclusive form of the knowledge economy has education and economy requirements. They are a necessary condition, but they're very far from being a sufficient condition. There have to be a series of other changes in access to economic opportunity and economic power, without which the educational changes, all by themselves, will not produce the desired result. And that's not just a dogmatic thesis. We have a great deal of experience in the world with attempts to overcome the insularity of the knowledge economy by skilling programs. They don't do it. And so then we have to have a dispute about why they don't do it. There are a series of requirements. Educational, cognitive requirements, moral or social requirements. The knowledge economy requires an elevation of the level of trust and reciprocal discretion and accumulation of social capital. And institutional requirements, the redesign of the market economy to democratize access to economic opportunities and capabilities. And then there's the whole question of the background conditions in politics and in culture that would make it more or less likely that we would be able to satisfy these requirements. So I think what is dangerous is if in understanding the dimension of this task, we begin to think of it as a system in which either we have to do everything or we do nothing. So, and this is the bad old idea about structure that comes to us from Marxism. So it's like saying, real change would be the substitution of capitalism by socialism. It would be a revolutionary systemic change. That's not in the cards. And if it were in the cards, it would be too dangerous. So then what's left to do? What's left to do is to humanize the existing one. So then the progressives appear on the stage of history as the humanizers of the inevitable. And the idea of revolution, of systemic change, is converted into an alibi for its opposite. That's what we have in the world. And we're here to do something, to try to do something in a very different direction.
Okay, so next week we're going to be getting deeper into market economy and capitalism and how they can be restructured. A reminder for those of you Kennedy School students that the first reading assignment will be due on Monday morning, early Monday morning, and reading assignment will be online on campus sometime. See you next week.
he started off, okay, like. I didn't know you were in the
In terms of his mind expansion. Never is
Yeah, and then I reconned my room. I was like, oh my god, I still have one.
Oh yeah, it's called the Leaves of Existence. It's called Topics. Topics in Political it's tomorrow, but it's medium to undergrads. But the thing about the course is like 8 9 exams, and lecture के बजाय it's more of a